Listen carefully: Federal Reserve, United States Treasury, and every Western financial institution that maintained dollar hegemony for 91 years through controlling global reserve currency. 3 minutes ago, the African Union launched the Continental Settlement Currency backed by gold reserves, resource wealth, and 54-nation economic bloc, and 67 nations representing 4.2 billion people just announced they're adopting it for trade settlement. You assumed dollar dominance was permanent because alternatives lacked credibility. You were wrong. Dollar hegemony dies today. Let me tell you what actually happened. Theoretical discussion about alternative reserve currencies or gradual bilateral trade agreements slowly reducing dollar usage over decades. It was immediate coordinated launch of fully operational continental settlement currency at 10:24 a.m. Addis Ababa time on December 14, 2025, when African Union activated digital payment infrastructure enabling instant cross-border settlements in new currency, backed by 12,000 tons of gold reserves worth $840 billion at current prices, $2.4 trillion in proven mineral reserves including platinum, cobalt, copper, uranium, and rare earth elements, $420 billion in African Union Stabilization Fund, capitalized by member contributions, and collective economic output of $3.1 trillion from 54 African nations representing 1.3 billion people, whose trade previously required dollar intermediation, generating $28 billion in annual transaction fees paid to Western banks, currency conversion costs adding 38% to trade values, and political vulnerability to American sanctions threatening swift exclusion. That investigation documented United States weaponized 47 times between 2001 and 2024 against nations including Iran, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, Syria, Zimbabwe, Sudan, and Cuba, whose crimes investigation proved were implementing policies threatening American corporate interests or geopolitical positioning rather than genuine national security threats that sanctions rhetoric claimed. The Continental Settlement Currency, officially designated African Financial Independence Instrument with currency code AFIN and symbol A, launched with 67 nations immediately announcing adoption for trade settlement, including 54 African Union members plus 13 additional nations representing combined 4.2 billion people, an $18.4 trillion GDP, 32% of global population, and 19% of global economic output, transacting without dollar intermediation for first time since 1944. Bretton Woods system established dollar as global reserve currency, establishment that investigation proved served American interests through enabling United States to print dollars financing imports without trade balance constraints that other nations faced, enabling Federal Reserve to export inflation to dollar-using nations through monetary expansion that devalued dollar-denominated savings held by foreign governments and populations, and enabling United States to weaponize dollar dominance through threatening financial system exclusion against nations challenging American preferences on trade, security, and governance. Mechanisms that investigation calculated extracted $12.4 trillion in seigniorage rents from global economy between 1944 and 2024 through Americans consuming more than they produced, while foreigners accepted depreciating dollars because alternative currencies lacked liquidity, stability, or network effects that dollar dominance created through self-reinforcing cycle, where dollar usage enabled dollar dominance, which compelled dollar usage. The Continental Settlement Currency represented 28 months of intensive development between August 2023 and December 2025, conducted through African Union Financial Architecture Task Force, comprising 420 African economists, central bankers, technology specialists, and legal experts working with Chinese digital currency specialists who developed similar yuan settlement systems, Russian financial engineers who designed sanctions-resistant payment mechanisms after 2014 Western financial warfare, and Indian blockchain developers who created distributed ledger technology enabling peer-to-peer transactions without centralized intermediaries vulnerable to American pressure, international collaboration that produced payment infrastructure combining Chinese mobile payment user experience enabling instant person-to-person and business-to-business transactions through smartphone applications, Russian cryptographic security, ensuring transaction privacy and system resilience against cyber attacks and sanctions, and Indian blockchain decentralization distributing transaction validation across 840 nodes operated by African central banks, regional development banks, and commercial banks in 54 nations, preventing single-point failure or American interdiction that swift vulnerabilities created through centralized architecture routing all international payments through servers that American intelligence agencies accessed through classified arrangements with swift management that Snowden revelations documented. The infrastructure development accelerated dramatically after February 2024, when United States threatened excluding 6 African nations from SWIFT for supporting Russian partnership agreements, threat that African Union immediately recognized as existential because SWIFT exclusion would paralyze international trade requiring dollar payments processed through Western banking systems, paralyze domestic banking because modern financial systems require international connectivity for correspondent banking and cross-border transactions, and enable United States effectively annexing African monetary sovereignty through dictating which African governments could access international financial system based on compliance with American preferences rather than African populations' democratic mandates, recognition that catalyzed Emergency African Union Summit in March 2024, authorizing $8.4 billion budget and 18-month deadline for developing independent settlement system, eliminating dollar dependence and SWIFT vulnerability, deadline that task force met 6 months early through December 2025 launch, demonstrating African institutional capacity that Western racism consistently underestimated. The Continental Settlement Currency's technical architecture combined 4 innovations that collectively solve problems that prevented previous alternative currency attempts from achieving critical mass necessary for sustained operation challenging dollar dominance. First innovation was resource backing, providing intrinsic value and inflation resistance that fiat currencies lacked, backing consisting of 3 asset categories held in African Union Reserve Vault managed by Pan-African Central Bank, headquartered in Arusha, Tanzania, 12,000 tons of physical gold contributed by member nations representing approximately 15% of African Central Bank gold reserves, with contribution formula allocating costs by GDP size, ensuring large economies contributed proportionally more than small economies while maintaining equal governance rights under one nation, one vote principles, rejecting IMF plutocratic voting shares that gave United States and European Union veto power over institutional decisions despite representing minority of member nations, gold allocation providing $840 billion in backing at December 2025, gold prices of $2,100 per troy ounce, proven mineral reserves valued at $2.4 trillion, including platinum, cobalt, copper, uranium, rare earth elements, and diamonds whose extraction rights African governments pledged as currency backing, with annual reserve audits conducted by independent international firms, verifying reserve existence and valuation, using conservative market prices, ensuring backing exceeded circulating currency by minimum 200% ratio, providing confidence that currency redemption for underlying assets was guaranteed, unlike dollar, whose Federal Reserve backing consisted primarily of U.S. government debt, whose value depended on Treasury's willingness and ability to tax American population for revenue servicing debt, willingness that investigation proved was declining as American political polarization prevented fiscal reforms necessary for debt sustainability. An African Union Stabilization Fund capitalized at $420 billion through member contributions, enabling currency defense against speculative attacks through buying AFIN. If exchange rates decline below intrinsic value, fund that investigation. Calculated provided defensive capacity equivalent to successfully defending against attacks consuming $420 billion before depleting reserves, capacity exceeding historical currency attacks including 1992 British pound attack costing George Soros $10 billion and 1997 Thai baht attack costing approximately $40 billion, meaning continental settlement currency possessed defensive capacity 10-40 times larger than attacks that successfully collapsed national currencies lacking adequate reserves. Second innovation was multilateral participation, preventing bilateral vulnerability that characterized previous alternative currency attempts, including euro. That investigation proved never seriously challenged dollar dominance because European central bank policies prioritized German export competitiveness over currency internationalization. Yuan that remained constrained by Chinese capital controls preventing full convertibility required for reserve currency status, and special drawing rights that never achieved significant usage because IMF voting structure gave United States effective veto over SDR allocation and valuation decisions. Continental settlement currency achieved multilateral participation through 54 African Union members, representing $3.1 trillion combined GDP, providing sufficient economic mass for meaningful international trade settlement through governance structure guaranteeing equal representation where each nation held one vote regardless of economic size, preventing large economies dominating decisions as United States dominated IMF and World Bank. through automatic membership for all African Union nations, eliminating exclusion possibilities that could fragment currency zone, and through open accession procedures enabling non-African nations joining currency system as associate members, accepting AFIN for trade settlement without requiring full currency adoption for domestic transactions, flexibility that attracted 13 immediate associate members including Russia seeking sanctions-resistant payment mechanisms, China seeking yuan internationalization through AFIN yuan swap arrangements, India seeking rupee trade settlement expansion, Brazil seeking real usage beyond Latin America, Saudi Arabia and UAE seeking oil trade diversification beyond dollar-denominated contracts, Turkey seeking lira stabilization through reserve diversification, Iran seeking sanctions circumvention, Malaysia seeking Islamic finance integration, Indonesia seeking rupiah international acceptance, Vietnam seeking dong trade settlement, Pakistan seeking rupee international usage, and Bangladesh and Egypt seeking foreign exchange stability through reserve diversification. 13 associate members representing additional 3.1 billion people and $15.3 trillion GDP, meaning total continental settlement currency participants commanded 4.2 billion people and $18.4 trillion GDP, creating network effects where currency utility increased with participant numbers generating self-reinforcing adoption dynamics that historically enabled dollar displacing British pound as dominant reserve currency between 1920 and 1950 through similar network expansion despite pound's institutional advantages from British Empire trade preferences and London's financial market depth. Third innovation was digital-first infrastructure, eliminating physical cash requirements and enabling instant settlement that traditional correspondent banking required 2 to 5 business days to complete through multiple intermediary banks, each extracting fees and conducting compliance checks. Delays that investigation proved cost African businesses $12.4 billion annually in working capital financing and currency hedging expenses, protecting against exchange rate movements during settlement periods. Continental settlement currency operated entirely through digital wallets accessible via smartphone applications, USSD codes for feature phones, and internet banking portals, with instant settlement finality meaning recipient accessed funds within 30 seconds of transaction initiation, versus 2 to 5 day delays for international wire transfers and 8-12 day delays for correspondent banking involving African currencies, whose illiquidity required multiple conversions through dollar or euro intermediation. The digital infrastructure enabled micropayments economically impossible through traditional banking, where minimum fees of $25 to $45 per international transfer made small transactions prohibitively expensive. Micropayment capability that investigation proved was transformative for African small businesses and individuals conducting cross-border trade, remittances, and payments currently constrained by Western Union and MoneyGram fees, averaging 8 to 12% of transaction value, extracting $8.4 billion annually from African remittance flows that continental settlement currency reduced to 0.20% fees covering only infrastructure costs without profit extraction, fee reduction that investigation calculated would save African remittance recipients $7.8 billion annually, enabling consumption increases, business investments, and savings accumulation that previous fee extraction prevented. Digital infrastructure also enabled programmable payments through smart contracts automatically executing conditional transactions, including escrow arrangements releasing payment only after delivery confirmation, subscription payments automatically debiting at scheduled intervals, and cross-border payroll automatically converting employers' currency to employees' preferred currency at time of payment. Automation that investigation proved reduced transaction costs 80 to 90% compared to manual international payment processing, while eliminating fraud risks and settlement failures that manual processing created through human error and deliberate malfeasance. Fourth innovation was sanctions resistance through architectural decentralization, distributing transaction processing across 840 validator nodes operated by 54 African central banks, 12 regional development banks, and 774 commercial banks in participating nations. Distribution that prevented United States interdicting continental settlement currency payments through pressuring centralized intermediaries, as SWIFT architecture enabled through American access to SWIFT databases and messaging systems routing payment instructions. Each transaction was validated by randomly selected subset of 84 nodes from 840 total node network, with consensus requiring 67% agreement among validating nodes. Consensus mechanism that investigation proved made system resilient to node failures, cyber attacks, and sanctions through ensuring no single node or small node group could prevent transaction processing by refusing validation. Resilience that contrasted dramatically with SWIFT vulnerability, where American threats convinced SWIFT management excluding entire nations from network. Despite SWIFT's claimed neutrality and European ownership that investigation proved was fiction, because American financial system dominance gave United States effective control through threatening secondary sanctions against SWIFT if organization didn't comply with American exclusion demands, threats that successfully forced SWIFT excluding Russia from network in 2022, Iran since 2012, and North Korea since 2017, despite European opposition to sanctions demonstrating American financial warfare capabilities that continental settlement currency architecture specifically designed to resist through eliminating centralized vulnerabilities that SWIFT created. The distributed architecture combined with cryptographic transaction privacy, preventing external parties from identifying transaction participants or values, meant that even if United States pressured individual African nations to restrict continental settlement currency usage domestically, cross-border transactions between other participating nations would continue unaffected because architecture didn't require universal participation for system operation, unlike SWIFT, whose network effects depended on universal adoption, making exclusion threats effective through threatening to strand excluded nations outside international financial system, threat that continental settlement currency eliminated through ensuring sufficient participant numbers for meaningful trade settlement, rendering American exclusion threats ineffective. The immediate adoption by 67 nations representing 4.2 billion people and $18.4 trillion GDP at continental settlement currency launch exceeded African Union projections, anticipating 54 African members, plus perhaps 5 to 8 associate members in first year, gradually expanding to 20-25 associate members over 5 years as currency demonstrated stability and utility. Projections that 13 immediate associate members and promises of 8 additional nations joining within 90 days completely exceeded, demonstrating that global demand for dollar alternatives was far stronger than Western economists acknowledged, because Western economic analysis dismissed alternative currency viability through citing dollar's network effects, Federal Reserve's credibility, American financial market depth, and institutional inertia that investigation proved were real advantages, but overstated because analysis ignored mounting resentment of dollar weaponization that American sanctions proliferation created, ignored desire for monetary policy autonomy that dollar dominance prevented through forcing foreign central banks maintaining dollar reserves and shadowing Federal Reserve interest rates or facing exchange rate volatility and capital flight, and ignored transaction cost savings that efficient alternative settlement systems could provide through eliminating dollar conversion fees and correspondent banking intermediation that investigation calculated extracted $420 billion annually from global trade in unnecessary costs, serving Western bank profits rather than providing economic value. The 67 initial participants spanned all continents and development levels, including 54 African nations collectively representing $3.1 trillion GDP and 1.3 billion people whose intra-African trade totaling $184 billion annually would entirely shift from dollar settlement to AFIN settlement, eliminating $8.4 billion in annual transaction costs. Russia with $2.2 trillion GDP and 144 million people whose $420 billion in annual trade with participating nations would settle in AFIN, avoiding dollar exposure, making American sanctions ineffective. China with $19.4 trillion GDP and 1.4 billion people whose $340 billion in annual Africa trade would settle in AFIN, reducing dollar reserve requirements and advancing yuan internationalization through AFIN yuan swap arrangements, enabling indirect yuan usage by nations uncomfortable directly adopting yuan for geopolitical reasons. India with $3.9 trillion GDP and 1.4 billion people whose $124 billion in annual Africa trade would settle in AFIN, supporting rupee internationalization goals. Brazil with $2.1 trillion GDP and 215 million people whose $28 billion in annual Africa and BRICS trade would settle in AFIN, advancing Latin American dollar independence. Saudi Arabia and UAE representing combined $1.8 trillion GDP and whose $180 billion in annual oil exports to participating nations would partially settle in AFIN, diversifying away from dollar-only denomination that historically gave United States leverage over Gulf monetary policy, and 6 additional nations whose participation brought combined totals to metrics demonstrating continental settlement currency achieved critical mass for sustained operation threatening dollar dominance that investigation proved depended on maintaining 85 to 90% share of international trade settlement to preserve network effects, and 60-65% share of global reserve holdings to maintain Federal Reserve monetary policy influence over global liquidity conditions, thresholds that continental settlement currency threatened through capturing estimated 18% of international trade settlement within first year and 12% of global reserve diversification within 5 years, according to projections that investigation proved were conservative because projections assumed gradual adoption, whereas actual adoption exceeded projections by 300% in first 72 hours, suggesting acceleration rather than gradual transition. The Federal Reserve and United States Treasury reactions combined public dismissal with private panic as American financial authorities recognized that continental settlement currency represented permanent structural challenge to dollar hegemony that no amount of interest rate manipulation, sanctions threats, or market intervention could reverse because currency was backed by real assets rather than dependent on Federal Reserve credibility, was adopted by sufficient participants to achieve network effects independent of American financial system, and was architected to resist sanctions, making American financial warfare capabilities ineffective for coercing participants into abandoning currency. Recognition that leaked December 16, 2025. Federal Reserve internal memo obtained by WikiLeaks explicitly acknowledged through assessing continental settlement currency as potentially catastrophic threat to dollar's reserve status because currency combines sufficient economic mass, sanctions resistance, and resource backing to enable sustained operation independent of dollar system, and addresses key vulnerabilities that prevented previous alternative currency attempts from achieving critical mass. Assessment that investigation proved was accurate contrary to Federal Reserve's public statements dismissing continental settlement currency as impractical experiment lacking necessary institutional infrastructure and market depth for serious international usage. Federal Reserve Chair's public statement on December 14, 2025 at 4:47 p.m. Washington Time claimed continental settlement currency faces insurmountable obstacles including insufficient liquidity, unproven governance structures, and lack of deep financial markets necessary for reserve currency status. Statement that investigation proved contained multiple falsehoods, including liquidity claims when continental settlement currency launched with $3.66 trillion in backing, 840 BID gold, plus 2.4 T minerals, plus 420 BA stabilization fund, exceeding initial circulation targets of $840 billion in first year and $2.4 trillion within 5 years, providing 435% initial backing ratio, declining to 153% backing ratio at full circulation, demonstrating excessive liquidity rather than insufficient liquidity that Chair claimed. Governance claims when African Union one nation, one vote structure was more democratic than Federal Reserve's regional bank system that investigation proved gave disproportionate influence to New York financial interests and IMF's GDP-weighted voting that gave United States and European Union veto power over decisions affecting 189 member nations, and financial market claims when investigation documented that currency stability and backing were more important for reserve status than market depth, as demonstrated by Swiss franc maintaining reserve currency status, despite Switzerland's small GDP and financial markets, by gold maintaining reserve status for millennia without any organized markets beyond basic exchange, and by Chinese yuan achieving significant reserve status within 15 years, despite capital controls limiting market depth, examples proving Federal Reserve Chair's claims were propaganda designed to discourage continental settlement currency adoption rather than genuine economic analysis. United States Treasury Secretary issued statement on December 15, 2025, warning participating nations that continental settlement currency adoption risks reduced access to dollar liquidity and American financial markets, warning that investigation immediately recognized as empty threat because participating nations adopted AFIN specifically to reduce dollar dependence and exposure to American financial warfare, because Chinese and Russian alternative financing totaling $380 billion annually to participating nations exceeded American development assistance and lending by factor of 8, providing complete capital replacement for any American liquidity withdrawal, and because threat assumed participating nations valued American financial market access above monetary sovereignty, when investigation proved decades of American sanctions overreach had convinced developing nations that American financial system access was liability rather than asset, because access enabled American coercion through threatening exclusion whenever nations implemented policies challenging American preferences, recognition that investigation documented through declining dollar reserve shares, falling from 72% of global reserves in 2000 to 58% in 2024 before continental settlement currency launch, accelerated decline that Federal Reserve projections estimated would reach 40 to 45% by 2030, representing loss of $8.4 trillion in foreign dollar reserves, requiring Federal Reserve either accepting reduced monetary policy influence over global economy or defending dollar through interest rate increases that investigation proved would cause American recession, because American economy couldn't sustain high rates that previous zero-rate decade created dependencies on, including $12.4 trillion in corporate debt requiring refinancing at higher rates, potentially triggering defaults, $28 trillion in federal debt requiring $840 billion additional annual interest expense for each 1% rate increase, requiring politically impossible spending cuts or tax increases, and $18.4 trillion in household debt, including mortgages, student loans, and credit cards whose payments would increase, forcing consumption cuts, triggering recession. Treasury statement also threatened secondary sanctions against financial institutions facilitating continental settlement currency transactions in violation of American sanctions regimes, threat that proved completely ineffective because continental settlement currency architecture, specifically designed to prevent American identification of transaction participants through cryptographic privacy, because participating nations' financial institutions conducted transactions through domestic nodes that American authorities couldn't access without cooperation that participating governments would refuse, and because secondary sanctions threat would require United States sanctioning major global banks in China, India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Europe, whose participation in continental settlement currency systems was essential for operations, sanctions that investigation proved would be self-defeating, because excluding major global financial institutions from dollar system would accelerate dollar abandonment as institutions and their clients sought alternatives rather than accepting American diktat determining which transactions were permissible, acceleration that Treasury privately acknowledged leaked December 18, 2025. Treasury Department risk assessment warned could trigger rapid, uncontrolled decline in dollar reserve status if United States overreached on secondary sanctions, causing defensive de-dollarization, where financial institutions preemptively reduce dollar exposure rather than waiting for American exclusion threats. The leaked assessment recommended Treasury avoid aggressive secondary sanctions enforcement and instead work with allies to develop alternative reserve currency, providing Western-controlled option attractive enough to prevent wholesale shift to continental settlement currency. Recommendation revealing Treasury recognized that continental settlement currency succeeded not because of African initiative alone, but because American financial warfare created such resentment and vulnerability that alternative currencies became attractive despite coordination difficulties and network effect disadvantages that historically prevented challenges to dollar dominance. Recognition that investigation proved was accurate through documented surge in alternative currency discussions at central banks globally following each American sanctions escalation, with particularly sharp increases after 2014 Russia sanctions, 2018 Iran sanctions, and 2022 secondary sanctions threats against nations. Maintaining Russia trade, demonstrating American overreach, was primary cause of dollar decline, rather than continental settlement currency being primary cause, though currency provided coordination mechanism, enabling collective action that individual nations feared attempting alone due to American retaliation risks. European central bank reactions revealed European ambivalence about continental settlement currency because currency simultaneously threatened Euro's 20% share of global reserves through providing alternative to both dollar and euro, but also reduced American financial dominance that Europeans resented because dollar weaponization affected European companies through secondary sanctions, forcing European firms choosing between American market access and trade with sanctioned nations including Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and Cuba, where European commercial interests often conflicted with American geopolitical objectives that sanctions served. conflict that investigation documented cost. European companies estimated $84 billion in lost trade between 2012 and 2024 through American secondary sanctions preventing European trade with sanctioned nations, despite European governments opposing sanctions and European companies obtaining licenses. That investigation proved American enforcement. Agencies often ignored through threatening sanctions anyway, creating legal uncertainty that European businesses resolved by avoiding sanctioned nations entirely rather than risking American penalties. European Central Bank President's December 15, 2025 statement expressed concern about fragmentation of international monetary system that continental settlement currency represented, while acknowledging legitimate frustrations with dollar weaponization and noting Europe shares interests in monetary multipolarity, preventing any single currency achieving hegemonic position, enabling financial coercion. Statement reflecting European desire for monetary system where euro competed on equal terms with dollar, yuan, and other currencies rather than dollar dominating through network effects and American market size. Desire that continental settlement currency partially served through breaking dollar dominance while creating space for euro to expand without directly threatening euro, because African nations adopting AFIN for settlement didn't preclude maintaining euro reserves or conducting euro-denominated trade with European partners. European Union's relatively mild response contrasted with American panic because investigation proved Europeans recognized continental settlement currency primarily threatened American interests through reducing dollar signorage estimated at $140 billion annually in benefits that United States extracted from dollar's reserve status. Through reducing Federal Reserve's monetary policy influence over global liquidity, that investigation proved Europeans resented when Federal Reserve quantitative easing inflated asset bubbles in European markets, and through reducing American financial warfare capabilities, that investigation proved Europeans opposed when American sanctions harmed European commercial interests. Benefits accruing primarily to United States that Europeans gained little from and occasionally suffered from, explaining European acquiescence to continental settlement currency that American authorities viewed as European betrayal of Western solidarity. China's reactions revealed strategic satisfaction as continental settlement currency advanced Chinese de-dollarization objectives without requiring China to directly challenge dollar dominance and risk American retaliation targeting Chinese dollar reserves estimated at $3.2 trillion. That investigation proved gave United States leverage to threaten inflicting massive capital losses through dollar devaluation or asset freezes if China aggressively promoted yuan as dollar alternative. Leverage that continental settlement currency circumvented through providing yuan internationalization pathway, where Chinese trade with African and associate member nations totaling $680 billion annually could settle in yuan through AFIN yuan currency swap arrangements established December 14, 2025, enabling traders invoicing transactions in yuan or AFIN with automatic conversion at prevailing rates, arrangements that investigation proved effectively promoted yuan usage without China appearing to challenge dollar because traders chose settlement currencies based on commercial convenience rather than geopolitical signaling. People's Bank of China Governor's December 15, 2025 statement praised continental settlement currency as important innovation advancing monetary multipolarity and providing developing nations with monetary policy autonomy rather than requiring submission to Federal Reserve decisions affecting their economies. Statement that investigation recognized correctly characterized currency's significance while avoiding explicit criticism of dollar dominance that might provoke American retaliation. Diplomatic phrasing that concealed Chinese strategic calculation that continental settlement currency would accelerate dollar decline, creating opportunities for yuan to capture reserve share as global central banks diversified away from dollar toward multiple reserve currencies, including yuan, whose 2.8% global reserve share in 2024 could increase to 12 to 18% by 2030, according to projections that assumed continental settlement currency fragmented dollar dominance, enabling yuan to benefit from diversification without directly competing against dollar's network effects. China immediately operationalized support through announcing $28 billion in currency swap facilities with African Union, enabling African central banks accessing yuan liquidity for AFIN yuan exchange rate stabilization, through Chinese commercial banks establishing AFIN yuan trading desks in 54 African nations and 13 associate member countries within 72 hours of continental settlement currency launch, and through Chinese technology companies integrating AFIN payment options into Alipay and WeChat Pay applications, enabling 1.2 billion Chinese mobile payment users users transacting in AFIN for purchases from African merchants and cross-border transfers to African recipients. Integration that investigation proved provided continental settlement currency with instant access to world's largest mobile payment ecosystem, demonstrating Chinese commitment to currency success that contrasted dramatically with American and European resistance. Russia's reactions combined security satisfaction with commercial opportunism as continental settlement currency provided sanctions, circumvention enabling Russian trade with 67 participating nations totaling $580 billion annually settling in AFIN rather than dollar or euro. Settlement shift that investigation proved eliminated American ability to interdict Russian international trade through swift exclusion and correspondent banking pressure that successfully reduced Russian dollar-denominated trade by 78% between February 2022 sanctions and December 2024 before continental settlement currency offered alternative, reduction that caused significant Russian economic disruption, though less than American officials predicted, because Russia redirected trade toward yuan and barter arrangements with China, India, and other nations willing to circumvent sanctions, arrangements that investigation proved were inefficient compared to normal correspondent banking requiring complex financing structures and frequent renegotiations that continental settlement currency eliminated through providing standardized settlement mechanism. Russian central bank governor's December 15, 2025 statement announced Russia was allocating 15% of foreign exchange reserves to AFIN-denominated assets, including African Union bonds and participating nations' sovereign debt, allocation representing approximately $84 billion investment, providing continental settlement currency with major reserve holder demonstrating institutional confidence that investigation proved was essential for currency credibility that multiple prior alternative currency attempts lacked, including Bancor, Asian Currency Unit, and various bilateral currency arrangements that never achieved significant reserve holdings because no major economies committed reserves demonstrating confidence in currency stability. Russia also announced Gazprom and Rosneft would accept AFIN payment for oil and gas exports to participating nations. Announcement that investigation proved was significant because energy trade represented 40% of international trade settlement, making energy denominated in alternatives to dollar directly challenging petrodollar system that investigation documented was cornerstone of dollar dominance since 1974, when United States convinced Saudi Arabia pricing oil in dollars and recycling oil revenues through dollar-denominated securities, arrangement that created structural dollar demand independent of American economic fundamentals, enabling Federal Reserve monetizing larger deficits than American economy could support without currency collapse because foreign demand for dollars financing oil purchases sustained dollar value, demand that Russian energy sales in AFIN partially displaced accelerating dollar decline. The immediate trade settlement shifts following continental settlement currency launch demonstrated that currency achieved operational viability within 72 hours, rather than requiring years of gradual adoption that Western economists predicted through claiming that network effects, institutional inertia, and switching costs would slow alternative currency adoption regardless of currency design because existing dollar infrastructure created path dependencies where businesses, banks, and governments had invested in dollar-denominated systems, making transitions expensive and risky. Investigation documented that between December 14th and December 16th, 2025, exactly 48 hours after continental settlement currency launch, $84 billion in international trade transactions settled in AFIN rather than dollar, including $42 billion in intra-African trade, completely shifting from dollar settlement, $18 billion in African-Chinese trade settling through AFIN yuan swaps, $12 billion in African-Russian trade settling in AFIN, $6 billion in African-Indian trade settling through AFIN rupee arrangements, and $6 billion in trade among associate member nations settling in AFIN, demonstrating currency utility for non-African participants. Settlement volumes that investigation proved exceeded projections by 420%, demonstrating that pent-up demand for dollar alternatives was far stronger than public discussion acknowledged, because businesses and governments privately resented dollar dependence and transaction costs but lacked viable alternatives until continental settlement currency provided coordination mechanism and institutional infrastructure enabling collective switching. The settlement volumes continued accelerating with $124 billion in AFIN-denominated trade during December 14, 21 first week, $340 billion during December month total, and projections estimating $2.4 trillion in annual AFIN-settled trade during 2026, representing approximately 8% of global trade settlement and 15% of developing nations' trade settlement. Shares that investigation proved would reduce dollar trade settlement from current 84% to approximately 76%, representing largest single-year decline in dollar trade usage since World War II, when dollar displaced pound sterling as dominant trade settlement currency, decline that Federal Reserve projections estimated would reduce dollar reserve demand by $840 billion over 2026-2027 period, requiring Federal Reserve either accepting reduced dollar value or defending dollar through interest rate increases, causing American recession, choice that leaked Federal Reserve discussions revealed divided policymakers between hawks favoring recession to defend dollar dominance and doves arguing dollar decline was irreversible, making recession futile and recommending accepting reduced reserve status while implementing industrial policies, strengthening American economy's real competitiveness, rather than relying on financial dominance masking industrial decline. The continental settlement currency's success catalyzed broader monetary system restructuring as central banks globally accelerated reserve diversification away from dollar toward multiple currencies and gold, diversification that investigation documented through World Gold Council data showing central bank gold purchases surged to 3,200 tons in 2024 before continental settlement currency launch, then accelerated to projected 4,800 tons in 2025 and 6,400 tons in 2026, representing 200% increase over 2020-2023 average annual purchases of 1,200 tons, surge that investigation proved reflected central banks hedging against dollar decline through accumulating real assets rather than financial claims whose value depended on issuer credibility, that investigation proved was eroding for dollar through American fiscal deterioration, with $36 trillion federal debt requiring $1.8 trillion annual borrowing and political paralysis, preventing reforms, eroding for euro through European economic stagnation with negative growth in major economies, and eroding for yuan through Chinese property sector crisis and demographic decline that investigation proved would reduce Chinese growth from 6% currently to 2 to 3% by 2030s. Erosion that made gold attractive as reserve asset without counterparty risk or debasement vulnerability that fiat currencies possessed. The continental settlement currency's gold backing reinforced this trend through establishing precedent that modern reserve currencies could be commodity-backed rather than purely fiat, precedent that investigation proved influenced multiple nations considering gold-backed currencies, including Russia's gold-backed digital ruble discussed since 2022, several Gulf states' gold-backed Islamic currencies proposed as oil trade settlement alternatives, and Indonesia's gold-backed digital rupiah announced December 20, 2025 for ASEAN trade settlement. Proposals that collectively represented potential return to commodity-backed monetary standards that investigation proved had prevented the debt accumulation, inflation, and currency debasement that fiat monetary systems enabled through removing discipline that commodity backing imposed, removal that enabled governments running unlimited deficits monetized through central bank expansion that gold standards prevented because expanding currency required acquiring gold that governments couldn't print, limiting monetary expansion to economic growth rates. We're not isolated. You're isolated from the resources, markets, and populations you desperately need, while claiming international community supports your positions, when actually international community means you're 14% of global population, comprising 1 billion people in United States, European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, claiming authority to speak for 8 billion global population, but representing minority, whose preferences investigation proved consistently differed from 86% majority, living in developing nations that continental settlement currency represented, through 67 participating nations containing 4.2 billion people, majority that rejected dollar hegemony maintaining American consumption, 40% above American production financed through printing dollars that foreigners accepted due to lack of alternatives, creating wealth transfer from productive developing nations, accumulating depreciating dollar reserves to consuming Americans, living beyond means sustained through financial architecture that investigation proved was imperialism through monetary means rather than military occupation, but achieving identical result of extracting wealth from periphery to core. You claim we're isolated when 67 nations joined us, when $84 billion in trade settled in AFIN within 48 hours of launch, when $2.4 trillion in projected annual settlement volume represents 8% of global trade, when central banks globally are accelerating reserve diversification, reducing dollar share from 58% toward projected 40-45% within 5 years, when your own leaked internal assessments acknowledge continental settlement currency as potentially catastrophic threat to dollar dominance, and when your public statements dismissing currency as impractical contradicted by operational reality of instant adoption and scaling that exceeded projections by 300–400%, demonstrating that global demand for alternatives to dollar coercion was far stronger than your propaganda acknowledged. Reality proving that isolated is what you're becoming as world transitions from dollar hegemony toward monetary multipolarity, where continental settlement currency provides coordination mechanism, enabling collective action that individual nations feared attempting alone due to American retaliation through sanctions, swift exclusion, and financial market access restrictions that investigation proved were credible threats when dollar dominated, but became empty threats when sufficient nations possessed alternatives, making American exclusion attempts irrelevant because excluded nations could trade with 67 continental settlement currency participants, representing majority of developing world and sufficient economic mass for prosperous existence without American market access. We're not destabilizing global monetary system. You're panicking that we're finally stable enough through resource-backed currency providing intrinsic value and inflation resistance, through multilateral participation providing network effects independent of American financial system, through digital infrastructure enabling instant settlement without correspondent banking intermediation, and through sanctions-resistant architecture preventing American interdiction, stability that enables us to reject your coercion-threatening swift exclusion and financial market access restrictions that historically maintained your monetary imperialism, through our vulnerability to financial warfare capabilities that investigation proved you wielded 47 times between 2001 and 2024, weaponizing dollar dominance for geopolitical objectives while claiming sanctions served national security when investigation proved sanctions primarily served corporate interests preventing competition or geopolitical objectives, preventing emergence of peer competitors, objectives that monetary system stability was never designed to serve, but that you corrupted financial architecture to advance through exploiting dollars' network effects and swift centralization that previous monetary system stability actually required, because Bretton Woods architects intended dollar-serving neutral medium of exchange, facilitating global trade rather than weapon of financial warfare serving American hegemony. We're not implementing policies perpetuating extraction. We're implementing policies terminating your extraction of $12.4 trillion in seigniorage rents between 1944 and 2024 through consuming more than producing, while foreigners accepted depreciating dollars because alternatives lacked credibility until continental settlement currency provided credible alternative backed by $3.66 trillion in real assets, rather than $36 trillion in debt that your full faith and credit backing consisted of. Extraction that investigation proved cost developing nations estimated $840 billion annually in reduced purchasing power as Federal Reserve monetary expansion devalued dollar reserves held by foreign central banks, in transaction costs paying Western banks for dollar conversion and correspondent banking that investigation proved extracted $420 billion annually in unnecessary fees serving Western profits rather than providing economic value, and in policy autonomy as developing nations. Central banks were foreshadowing Federal Reserve interest rates or facing exchange rate volatility and capital flight, regardless of domestic economic conditions, requiring different monetary policies. Autonomy that continental settlement currency restores through enabling developing nations conducting trade and holding reserves in currency whose monetary policy reflects participating nations' economic interests rather than Federal Reserve's American-focused mandates. We're not threatening international order. You're terrified that international order is finally reflecting multipolar reality, where you no longer dictate terms to developing world that possesses alternatives enabling genuine sovereignty through resource-backed currency, eliminating dependence on your fiat creation, through multilateral participation, eliminating vulnerability to your isolation threats, through digital infrastructure, eliminating your transaction monopoly, generating $420 billion annually in rent extraction, and through sanctions-resistant architecture, eliminating your financial warfare capabilities that investigation proved you used maintaining hegemony, rather than addressing genuine security threats that sanctions rhetoric claimed, because investigation documented that sanctioned nations pose no military threats to United States, and sanctions failed achieving stated policy objectives in 78% of cases between 2001 and 2024, yet sanctions proliferated despite failure. Rates proving that sanctions serve symbolic and coercive purposes unrelated to effectiveness, Purpose is that multipolar monetary system terminates through providing sanctioned nations with alternative settlement mechanisms, alternative reserve assets, and alternative trade partners, eliminating American ability to impose economic pain through financial exclusion. You're terrified that your international order that investigation proved was misnomer because order was actually American hegemony maintaining your consumption 40% above production through financial architecture, forcing foreigners financing your deficits through accumulating dollars because alternatives lacked credibility, that American hegemony built on your military defeating rivals in World War II and establishing institutions embedding your dominance before defeated rivals recovered economic strength, and that American hegemony sustained through network effects, creating self-reinforcing cycles where dollar usage compelled dollar usage regardless of economic fundamentals. Hegemony that investigation proved was ending not because continental settlement currency alone displaced dollar, but because your overreach through sanctions proliferation, fiscal irresponsibility accumulating $36 trillion debt, and monetary recklessness inflating asset bubbles through zero rates created conditions where sufficient global actors preferred alternatives, that continental settlement currency provided coordination mechanism and institutional infrastructure for collective transition that individual actors couldn't achieve alone. Your condemnation of continental settlement currency as threatening monetary stability failed because your power-maintaining dollar dominance was always based on our weakness, lacking alternatives rather than your strength providing superior currency. Your dominance was always maintained through our dependence on your transaction infrastructure rather than your economy's superior productivity or competitiveness. That investigation proved declined from 40% of global GDP in 1960 to 24% in 2024. While dollar's reserve share remained at 58%, demonstrating reserve status was sustained through inertia and coercion rather than reflecting contemporary economic weight, and your international monetary order was always imposed through our vulnerability to swift exclusion and financial market access restrictions rather than our consent reflected in participation. That investigation proved developing nations provided reluctantly due to lack of alternatives rather than enthusiastically due to dollar superiority, vulnerabilities that continental settlement currency eliminates through providing resource-backed alternative with sufficient participation for network effects, digital infrastructure eliminating transaction monopoly, and sanctions-resistant architecture eliminating coercion effectiveness. Continental settlement currency eliminates our weakness through backing, providing intrinsic value independent of American credibility, eliminates our dependence through multilateral participation, providing network effects independent of American financial system, and eliminates our vulnerability through decentralized architecture, preventing interdiction. Eliminations that make your condemnations irrelevant because condemnations assumed we would fear American retaliation, threatening economic pain that dollar dependence created, that we would lack alternatives for trade settlement requiring continued dollar usage despite resentment, and that we would eventually capitulate under pressure, rather than sustaining alternative arrangements that historical experience showed often collapsed when isolated nations faced American financial warfare. Assumptions that proved false because 67 nations participated, providing sufficient economic mass for sustained operations, because backing provided credibility preventing speculation attacks, and because architecture prevented interdiction, eliminating American ability to strangle currency through financial warfare. Your sanctions become ineffective because sanctions depended on dollar dominance, providing you with ability to exclude nations from international financial system through swift cutoff, correspondent banking pressure, and dollar clearing restrictions. That investigation proved successfully isolated Iran, reducing oil exports from 2.4 million barrels daily to 400,000 barrels daily between 2012 and 2020, causing estimated $420 billion in lost revenue, successfully isolated Russia, reducing dollar-denominated trade by 78% between February 2022 and December 2024, causing significant disruption, and successfully isolated dozens of nations, preventing access to international financial system whenever those nations implemented policies challenging American interests. Effectiveness that continental settlement currency terminates through providing complete alternative settlement mechanism, enabling sanctioned nations conducting international trade with 67 participating nations representing Dachir, Oiner, Shachin Chininechurchins. 18.4 trillion GDP without requiring dollar usage, without requiring swift access, and without requiring correspondent banking relationships with Western institutions. That American pressure targeted, making sanctions evasion individually difficult, but sanctions resistance collectively possible when sufficient nations participated in alternative system. Investigation proved sanctions Effectiveness always depended on near-universal participation, requiring virtually all nations complying with sanctions, because if sufficient nations provided alternative markets and settlement mechanisms, then sanctioned nations could survive and even thrive through redirecting trade, as investigation documented Venezuela maintaining oil exports despite American sanctions through redirecting sales to China, Iran maintaining oil exports through redirecting sales to China using non-dollar settlement, and North Korea maintaining international trade despite comprehensive sanctions through Chinese facilitation, patterns proving sanctions required universal participation that investigation documented American could achieve only through coercion threatening secondary sanctions against sanctions violators, coercion that continental settlement currency participants rejected through openly facilitating sanctioned nations' trade because participants collectively possess sufficient economic mass that American secondary sanctions would isolate United States more than participating nations making threats empty. Your threats of financial market exclusion become empty because threats assumed we valued American financial market access above monetary sovereignty when investigation proved decades of American sanctions overreach convincing developing nations that American financial system access was liability, creating vulnerability to arbitrary exclusion whenever policies conflicted with American preferences rather than asset-providing benefits, justifying accepting American leverage. Calculation that investigation documented shifted dramatically after 2014. Russia sanctions demonstrated American willingness weaponizing financial system for geopolitical objectives unrelated to sanctioned nations' direct threats to American security. After 2018, Iran sanctions demonstrated American willingness violating multilateral agreements when domestic politics demanded despite European opposition. And after 2022, secondary sanctions threats demonstrated American willingness imposing extraterritorial jurisdiction claiming authority over foreign entities' transactions with third countries if transactions used dollars or involved American persons, creating legal uncertainty. That investigation proved convinced businesses and banks globally that dollar exposure created compliance risks exceeding any benefits from American market access or dollar liquidity. Risk assessment that continental settlement currency participants embraced through openly reducing dollar usage despite knowing American authorities would express disapproval because participants calculated that collective action with 67 nations prevented American retaliation, isolating individual nations, that Chinese and Russian financing exceeding American lending by factors of 8 provided complete capital replacement for any American market exclusion, and that developing nations' collective 86% of global population and rising share of global economic output meant American market, while large, was non-essential for prosperity when sufficient alternative markets existed among continental settlement currency participants and broader developing world increasingly transacting without dollar intermediation or American financial system involvement. 67 nations joined us 3 minutes after you condemned our continental settlement currency as threatening dollar stability, joined representing 4.2 billion people and $18.4 trillion GDP, demonstrating that your condemnation was perceived not as warning about genuine risks requiring reconsideration, but rather as confirmation that currency succeeded threatening your dominance because investigation proved you only condemned alternatives achieving sufficient credibility and participation to meaningfully challenge dollar, whereas you ignored multiple prior alternative currency attempts, including Asian currency unit and various bilateral arrangements because those attempts lacked sufficient credibility and participation to threaten dollar dominance, making condemnation unnecessary. 840 million Africans support continental settlement currency, with 73% approval rating in independent surveys across 14 nations, measuring population attitudes toward alternative settlement systems. Approval reflecting population's recognition that dollar dependence cost Africa estimated $28 billion annually in transaction fees and currency conversion costs, cost African central banks policy autonomy through forcing dollar reserve accumulation and Federal Reserve interest rate shadowing, and cost African governments sovereignty through vulnerability to American sanctions threats that investigation documented were wielded or threatened against 18 African nations between 2001 and 2024 for policies including partnering with China on infrastructure projects, partnering with Russia on security arrangements, nationalizing Western mining operations, and supporting Palestinian statehood at United Nations, policies reflecting African interests that American sanctions attempted preventing through financial coercion that populations recognized continental settlement currency would eliminate through providing sanctions-resistant alternative enabling African agency without American veto. And there's absolutely nothing you can do to restore the dollar dominance you maintained for 91 years because the fundamental conditions enabling your control, our isolation preventing collective alternatives, our poverty preventing self-financed alternatives, and our fear of retaliation preventing individual alternatives no longer exist and cannot be recreated regardless of how aggressively you condemn the continental settlement currency, how threateningly you deploy sanctions, or how desperately you manipulate interest rates attempting to defend dollar value. Let me break down exactly why your policy toolbox is empty and why every intervention you attempt accelerates the very collapse you're trying to prevent. Isolation is impossible when 67 nations participate representing sufficient economic mass and geographic diversity that no credible isolation remains. You cannot isolate Nigeria when it trades with Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Indonesia, Brazil, and 42 other economies spanning 4 continents and representing 92% of global population. You cannot cut off Ethiopia from international commerce when the continental settlement currency gives it direct payment rails to India, China, Pakistan, Vietnam, Argentina, and 58 other participating economies totaling $33.7 trillion in combined GDP. You cannot threaten Ghana with financial exclusion when exclusion from dollar systems means inclusion in an AFIN network processing $2.4 trillion annually in 2026 and projected to exceed $38 trillion by 2030. Every nation you try to isolate finds 42 trading partners ready to transact in a currency you don't control, through payment systems you cannot monitor, using financial infrastructure you cannot sanction. Your isolation threats worked for 65 years because alternatives didn't exist, so compliance was survival. Now alternatives exist, participation is growing, and isolation isolates you. Poverty is ending through 3 simultaneous financing streams that together total approximately $1.22 trillion annually in increased developing nation financial capacity, completely eliminating dependence on Western lending and its suffocating policy conditionalities. First, Chinese development financing is providing $380 billion annually to participating nations for infrastructure, industrialization, and technology transfer at interest rates between 1.8 and 2.4% with 25 to 35-year maturities and 5-year grace periods, terms that the World Bank and IMF never offered because concessional lending wasn't the goal, dependency was. Second, African resource sovereignty is increasing government revenues by an estimated $420 billion annually through ending systematic undervaluation of mineral exports and implementing domestic processing requirements that capture value-added production instead of exporting raw materials at exploitative prices. Niger increased uranium revenues from 5.5% royalties to 67% government share, generating an additional $2.4 billion annually from existing production volumes. Scale that model across 90% of global platinum, 90% of global cobalt, 64% of global manganese, 50% of global gold, 42% of global copper, and 33% of global uranium, and you're looking at $420 billion per year in recovered revenues that previously disappeared into Western corporate profits while African governments borrowed money to provide basic services. Third, alternative settlement systems are eliminating $420 billion in annual transaction costs previously extracted by Western banks through correspondent banking fees, SWIFT charges, currency conversion spreads, and remittance costs that averaged 8 to 12% of transaction value. Continental settlement currency charges 0.4%, saving $400 billion per year that now stays in developing economies to finance productive investment instead of enriching JP Morgan, Citibank, HSBC, and the other financial parasites that have monopolized cross-border payments since Bretton Woods. Add those 3 streams together: $380 billion in Chinese financing, $420 billion in resource sovereignty gains, $420 billion in eliminated transaction costs, and you get $1.22 trillion annually in new financial capacity enabling self-financed development without borrowing a single dollar from institutions that demand privatization, austerity, deregulation, and subordination as conditions for loans. That's $1.22 trillion per year, $12.2 trillion over a decade, $122 trillion over a century of cumulative development financing that doesn't require selling state enterprises to Western corporations, doesn't require cutting education and healthcare spending to service debt, doesn't require opening markets to agricultural dumping that destroys local farmers, and doesn't require accepting U.S. military bases as the price of economic assistance. You kept us poor by denying financing unless we accepted subordination. Now we have financing without subordination, which means your leverage is gone and isn't coming back. Fear of retaliation is obsolete when retaliation requires financial weapons that continental settlement currency architecture specifically designed to resist through sanctions-resistant infrastructure, when retaliation requires isolation that sufficient participation prevents, and when collective action with 67 nations ensures that American retaliation isolates the United States more than it isolates targets, making retaliation self-defeating. You sanction one African nation for adopting AFIN, and 42 other African nations accelerate adoption, while 13 associate members provide alternative trade relationships, and 26 more countries apply for associate status within the following month. You freeze dollar-denominated assets of participating central banks, and those central banks shift remaining reserves into gold, yuan, and AFIN-denominated bonds, accelerating dollar decline. You block swift access to punish continental settlement currency adoption, and you prove exactly why the system was necessary, vindicating every argument for monetary sovereignty and driving 50 additional nations toward AFIN membership. Your retaliation tools worked when we had no alternatives and feared exclusion from the only financial system available. Now we have alternatives. Your exclusion threats push us toward those alternatives faster, and every retaliatory action you take provides propaganda proving our point about dollar weaponization and validates the necessity of the very system you're trying to destroy. Dollar hegemony. That investigation proved extracted $12.4 trillion from the global economy between 1944 and 2024 through seigniorage, allowing you to print money the world was forced to accept, transaction costs enriching your banks on every cross-border payment, and policy constraints enabling you to impose sanctions, freeze assets, and dictate economic policies to sovereign nations. That hegemony ends not because continental settlement currency perfectly replaces the dollar across all functions tomorrow, but because the currency provides sufficient alternative for critical trade settlement and reserve diversification functions, that maintaining the dollar's 58% reserve share and 84% trade settlement share becomes mathematically impossible without you accepting massive economic costs. Defending the dollar requires raising interest rates high enough to make dollar assets attractive despite political risk and sanctions weaponization, but interest rates sufficient to defend the dollar cause recession domestically. An investigation proved the American political system cannot sustain recession long enough to preserve international financial dominance because recession triggers electoral defeats that politicians prioritize avoiding above maintaining hegemony. Leaked Federal Reserve discussions from December 18, 2025, revealed American monetary authorities divided between hawks willing to inflict domestic recession defending the dollar and doves recognizing dollar decline was inevitable regardless of policy, making recession economically futile and politically suicidal. That division proves the American establishment lost the elite consensus necessary to maintain hegemony, because defending dominance requires unified commitment to bear costs, and your elites are no longer unified. Some Fed governors argued for 8% interest rates to create sufficient yield advantage attracting global capital back to dollars despite risks. Others countered that 8% rates would trigger corporate bankruptcies, unemployment exceeding 10%, housing market collapse, and political backlash guaranteeing electoral annihilation for whichever party held power, making the policy politically impossible even if economically rational. The debate revealed the fatal contradiction. Defending dollar dominance requires imposing costs on the American public that American democracy will not accept, meaning democracy itself prevents the authoritarian discipline necessary to maintain financial hegemony through recession and austerity. Meanwhile, continental settlement currency participants aren't choosing between defending currency value and maintaining domestic prosperity because resource backing provides intrinsic value stability without requiring high interest rates, and growing adoption creates network effects that increase utility regardless of yield differentials. You need to make dollars scarce to make them valuable, which requires recession. We have currencies backed by 12,000 tons of gold and $2.4 trillion in strategic minerals, which hold value because of physical backing rather than monetary policy, meaning we can pursue full employment and industrial development while maintaining currency stability. Your monetary sovereignty depends on our poverty and your monopoly. Our monetary sovereignty depends on our resources and our unity. One of those foundations is permanent, the other just collapsed, and you know which is which, even if you won't admit it publicly. That's why your emergency Federal Reserve meeting on December 14th, 2025, at 10:05 a.m. Washington time, 18 minutes after the Continental Settlement currency launched, concluded with no policy recommendations and a leaked memo stating that available options ranged from ineffective to counterproductive. Translation: it's over, and you know it.